Okay, I think we're live again. Welcome everyone. So I think this is our fourth Meet the Scholar webinar. So I usually do a quick introduction to this series. So Club Soda, we're very keen on research. So our whole ethos is based on using behavioral science to help people change their drinking habits. We do our own research, which you can find on our website, joinclubsoda.com. And we're also really happy to help academic researchers do their research, like Fiona's research that you'll see today. We've helped her a little bit with that.
You have, yes. Thank you.
Because we also run our own LGBTQI side project called Queers Without Beers, which is like sober meetups and events and other things for the LGBT community. So I will pass on to Claire Davey, who's a PhD student from Canterbury Christchurch College University. She's our host for these webinars, and then Claire will introduce Fiona. So take it away, Claire.
Great, thanks. So yeah, today's our fourth in the Meet the Scholar webinar series, and we've been talking to a range of academics about their research in the fields of well-being, alcohol, addiction and sobriety. I'm Claire Davey. I am a PhD student at Canterbury Christchurch University, and I'm researching themes of gender and sobriety. I'll be hosting today's discussion with Dr. Fiona Tasker, who's a reader in psychology at the Department of Psychological Sciences at Birkbeck University of London. Dr. Tasker has a phenomenally extensive back catalogue of publications, which can be found via her profile on the university website, and is on the editorial board of a number of journals. So her specialism is family psychology and affirmative systemic family therapy, which I'm sure she's best placed to expand on. But today's presentation is based on findings from her most recent research project within the LGBTQ community, researching young adult experiences of vulnerability and resilience during lockdown. So we've already heard from Dr. Abby Rose in January about the gender differences in drinking during lockdown. So I'm sure there'll be some overlapping and concurrent themes which will be developed on today. I can't wait to get stuck in. Thank you for taking the time, Fiona, to be here. Just a quick note. Thank you. Just before I hand over, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them underneath the viewing platforms, whether that's Facebook or YouTube. They'll feed through to us and we'll address them in a Q&A sort of discussion at the end. So Fiona, over to you and your presentation. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you, Juicy, for your kind introductions. And also thank you so much for your help with the studies that I'm going to talk about, particularly Queers Without Beers have been amazingly helpful in putting forward our adverts, and also I'm sure a few people have seen some of our other adverts via Facebook and Instagram about the cisgender heterosexual survey that we've also done, that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So as Claire said, my background is really in LGBTQ psychology and also in family psychology. Most of my studies involve some interest in family relationships, both the families we come from and the families that we form. I'm also very interested, as Claire said, in affirmative systemic psychotherapy, and so with that really I have interests in psychological well-being and vulnerability and resilience, and particularly keen to promote affirmative therapy for LGBTQ people. So that's a real need to have properly tuned in therapeutic help. So for those that need it. So that's a background to me, and by way of coming on to my interest in the pandemic that we've currently got and the associated lockdown measures and social restrictions, and my interest in both the problems that these create and also the positive opportunities that are there for some. And the research that we've done is really generally on mental health and psychological well-being, as I prefer to think of it. And also, by way of that, we also touch upon alcohol and substance use. So that's the background to today's talk. I'm not alone in doing this project. Thankfully, I have a lot of help from a researcher, Marie Horton, who works with me at Birkbeck University of London, and we've together put together the talk, but unfortunately Marie is not able to be here with us this lunchtime. So let me see if I can change the slides. So taking you back then over a year ago now to February in 2020, when we all first started hearing about the coronavirus pandemic and how it has arrived in first of all Europe and then in the UK. And with this sort of rising concern of panic and things disappearing off the supermarket shelves rapidly, the UK lockdown and household restrictions and social restrictions were first declared by the Prime Minister on the 20th of March. And this was a really sudden, drastic measure that we hadn't seen in peacetime in the UK, and nobody had really seen it coming. And amidst all these concerns and personal and family concerns, there was a lot of concerns about not just the pandemic, but also about the effects of lockdown on particularly vulnerable groups who might, under household restriction circumstances, be stuck at home with people who were not able to support them particularly well, and concerns about rising rates of mental health and well-being problems. I think people were almost at a point in March equally concerned about the pandemic, and by the end of March equally concerned about the effects of this sudden lockdown on vulnerable groups. So we started getting reports from BBC News about the pandemic, but also about lockdown. So there's this report that was produced on the 26th of March, with somebody being quoted in the newspaper saying, "I'm stuck in isolation with my homophobic parents." And we were particularly concerned about this situation for LGBTQ people stuck without support and possibly subjected to stressful situations and minority sexual and abuse and gender microaggressions and insults. So against this, we started to launch our project and our survey. We very quickly found by certainly the early autumn, there was starting to be scientific reports about mental health and well-being problems for the population as a whole. So I've put together a couple of studies here, which also have associated newspaper reports. These
Fiona,
are at the bottom of the page. Yes.
Fiona, I'm just going to interrupt and say, I think the slides are stuck on the first title slide. So
Oh.
I don't know whether you can sort of perhaps withdraw them and reset them, perhaps so that we can move them
along. Let me
oh, there we go. It's just moved.
Has it just moved?
Yes.
I think it's maybe, have I got control over sharing? Because I think I maybe have to have control over sharing in order to move them.
Okay, bear with me 1 second. Okay, so I think we can control behind the scenes. So when you want to switch slide, just say next slide and we can
okay.
do that. Yeah, great. Sorry, continue.
Okay. Okay, so by early autumn, we had reports from studies about mental health problems. And as I say, I've put together a couple of key studies that have told us these things. So they found that there was a rise in suicidal thoughts amongst people. That's from the O'Connor study, and the Pierce et al. Study did a breakdown of who was most affected by standard mental health problems. So we had younger age groups, 18 to 24-year-olds particularly affected, also with those up to 34 years old as well. We had women who were particularly vulnerable to mental health problems. We had people with young children who were also suffering with the pandemic and the lockdown. People who were employed before the pandemic but who'd lost jobs, they were also affected. And 83% of young people with mental health needs said that the lockdown was making them feel worse and aggravating problems. And yet, with the sort of contraction and the pressure of the pandemic on NHS services, there were fewer mental health appointments being given, and those at various crucial points went online rather than in person, and with associated restrictions upon therapy. So we not only had the earlier concerns about the effects of the lockdown, but by the autumn of 2020, we had some evidence from research studies as well. Okay, if we can have the next slide, please. So, what about alcohol and substance use problems, our particular concerns? Well, as you'll see from the bottom of the slide, again, there'd been reports on the BBC about rates of alcohol misuse and substance problems rising, and the possibility that the NHS wouldn't be able to cope with the demands. And then earlier this month, there was a release from the Office of National Statistics, the ONS Statistical Bulletin, which was quite widely covered in the BBC and mainstream news, about the quarterly statistics on alcohol specific related deaths, and that had risen again to its highest level for 20 years in England and Wales. So it's not just mental health problems, but we have evidence that certainly alcohol and drug use are increasing as well. And for some people, that's at health risk levels. So what did we do in our particular bit of research? Well, we were very lucky in May of last year to get a grant from the British Academy, specifically to look at LGBTQ people aged 18 to 35, and to do a series of surveys on the LGBTQ young people group over the pandemic and lockdown. And we did our first survey in May, June and July 2020. We did our second survey between September, and you'll see the dates there. The 23rd of September was when it was launched, and we closed it just before Christmas. And we were lucky enough to have some extra support from our university, Birkbeck, to expand the age group in our second survey. So we collected data from people up to 60 years old, and we had 515 LGBTQ plus people taking part in our survey. We're hoping to do a third survey sometime, probably this autumn, and expand the age range and our questions even further.
Great. Fiona, I think you just need to move on in the slides. I think you do have control from what we've been trying to do. So
okay, can I just check that? Is that on to the next slide? Yeah, okay.
No,
I'm going back.
We're still on mental health problems, I think, at the moment.
Are you? Right. I wonder if the thing to do is to stop and reload again so that I have control over it.
Okay.
That's if that's okay. So if I say stop screen, okay, and I then go to share again, yeah, and I share screen. I go to my window and I click share. Have we got mental health problems?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I'll move to the next one. Oops. Hang on. Sorry about this, folks.
That's all right. That's fine.
So are we at the next one?
No, so we're still in sort of like non-slideshow view, and it's mental health problems still. Are you able to start the slideshow before you switch it into this platform? That might work.
Okay.
Sorry.
Shall I? I can't start the slideshow before I switch it into this platform because I can't see the buttons to do that. It goes to my whole screen. That's the.
Or when you move it over, if you stay outside of do not click sort of start slideshow, and then just move down the concertina of slides rather than, I think when it goes into full slide view, it might freeze. So I think if you just sort of scroll down, that works.
Okay.
Let's see.
So I'm not sharing them at the moment, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, let me share screen, window, share. Right, so now you can see alcohol and substance use problems, is that right?
Not at the moment. Oh, it's coming up now.
Coming up now?
Yes, correct. That's exactly what I can see.
Now, let me see if I can
Yes, that's moving now. That's great. Fabulous.
There's a slight delay on it, isn't there? But not much. Okay, let me expand it slightly so you get more of the slide. Is that?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Is that okay? Right. Okay. I'm really sorry about that. It's difficult working the controls.
So many platforms to navigate. That's fine.
Absolutely, and everybody's computer's different. So I think I'd finished telling you about our LGBTQ surveys, that we're looking forward to doing a third survey, and we're also at the moment looking for people to interview for our study as well. More of that later. And we were lucky enough to have some money also from Birkbeck University to fund a parallel survey through the mainstream, basically to try and recruit some cisgender heterosexual people to also take part in a parallel study. So for that study, we ran the data collection slightly later than we did for the LGBTQ survey. The survey was launched middle of November and finished in the middle of January. And I've chosen 2 photographs so that you know which survey I'm talking about. Hopefully, as I go through next some of the results that we have from both surveys. And these are preliminary results. They really are our first look through. It takes quite a while to process these surveys and score up scales that we have on them, and we're really still in the process of doing that. So these are very basic results from our surveys that were to hand, and I hope will be of interest to everybody. So we asked about pandemic problems that people were experiencing, because we felt that this was a useful way to go through in our second round of surveying, to see what exactly it was that people found difficult in relation to the pandemic. And conversely, we were also aware that people were experiencing some positives in amongst the pandemic and the lockdown. But we weren't hearing very much about positives on the news or indeed in other studies. And we felt that in order to get a fuller picture of people's psychological experience and their well-being during the pandemic and associated lockdown periods, what was needed was a sort of look at the more particular almost individual level of experience of problems that they were having, because people are in different situations, they experience different things as difficult, and similarly they also experience different sort of situations and different things as gains or positives. So that's the background to our set of pandemic problems and pandemic positives, and we constructed these problems and also the positives that I'll talk about a bit later from a lot of the open-ended responses that we had in our first survey with LGBTQ groups that took place in May to June. We just simply asked people what the pandemic experience was like for them, what were the particular negatives that they experienced, and also separately, were there any positives that they were experiencing. And then from all the sort of things that people had very kindly written in, and some people wrote whole essays for us to digest. We then constructed these sets of scales. And as I said, there were 15 on our pandemic problems, or pandemic and lockdown problems that people experienced. So this is the results from our LGBTQ respondents aged 18 to 60 in our survey between September and November 2020, and the ratings that they gave. So as you'll see, we have 8 problems displayed on the page, and these vary, and they are put in order of importance. So we looked at each of the problems, and they were each rated on a 5-point scale. And we looked at people who identified any particular item as a big or a fairly big problem for them during the pandemic. So these were the 4 and 5 points on this 5-point scale. So to tick that, they rated it as a big problem for themselves. And we found that 53% of our LGBTQ respondents rated problems with mental health or well-being generally as big or fairly big problems for them. Next off was problems keeping myself fit, weight gain or weight loss. Third was missing a holiday break. Those were all over 40% of our respondents rated those as big or fairly big problems. Then just under that, we had missing Pride events. Obviously, the whole of Pride Month was cancelled, and it was hoped to be staged again in the autumn, but that took place in limited ways, some online celebrations, but it was all very, very difficult, and not at all clear what was going to happen either. So it was impossible to sort of organise and look forward to. Then 5th on our scale of problems was problems getting to health appointments and problems getting medication. And for some groups, that was particularly an issue. For trans and non-binary people, for example, that figured very, very highly, as a lot of services were disrupted, but also problems and issues with sexual health appointments as well figured in the things that people told us as to why they rated these as problems. Number 6 was problems accessing LGBTQ social or political spaces. And then we got down to number 7, which was problems shopping, which obviously a lot of people had, and was difficult too. We did have an item that looked at problems with increased alcohol, smoking, or substance use. That was the question that we asked, and we found that 14% of our LGBTQ respondents rated that as a big or a fairly big problem. So for some people, it was clearly a really big issue, but overall for LGBTQ people, that didn't figure as highly as, say, general problems with mental health or well-being, or issues like missing a holiday break. So what did people say about problems with mental health and well-being, as this was our most frequently identified problem? Well, as I say, over half respondents said it was a problem, compared to only 10% of people who checked the number 1 category on our scale to say it had not been a problem for them at all. So in a sense, the taking of the extremes on the scale kind of ignores the general issues which are at a lower level but are still there for a lot of other people. We also had a space for written comments, which people used, some people used for some things, didn't use for others. So we only have a sort of partial view. We don't have a view from all our respondents on what the particular issues were. But looking at those written responses, and as I say, this is just a preliminary look at these data that we have. What seems to be the case is that problems with mental health and well-being are associated with isolation and general stress levels during the pandemic, and also there's some elements of uncertainty about the future, and I think that is not to be underestimated. The kind of anxiety of anticipation of what might be problems. So here we have a couple of quotes which I will quickly read out that were directly taken from our survey. Definitely more lonely, as I often go weeks between seeing people, which makes me depressed and anxious. And somebody else wrote, periods of sadness and anxiety over pandemic and missing usual activities. And you can just feel people's distress when you read these comments. Okay. Isolation again was picked out, and it seemed to be particularly from being isolated from other LGBTQ friends, in particularly perhaps more than necessarily from groups and activities in general, but it was the feeling of friendship and support that was the problem. 26% of people rated that they feel extremely isolated from LGBTQ people. 15% mentioned cis-het friends as well. And it wasn't just friends that people were isolated from. If you weren't in a household lockdown with a partner, and until we had a sort of extensive bubble system, if you didn't live with a partner or one of your partners, you could end up feeling extremely isolated and without support. And anecdotally, we know that a lot of relationships were under a lot of strain, and some sadly broke up during this period. Somebody wrote in the survey, I haven't been able to express myself fully around my hetero roommates, even though they accept me. I am really missing queer spaces and the ability to connect with other LGBTQ people. Pandemic also isolated me from a partner I was seeing, and it has ended the relationship. And that kind of sums up those very difficult times and feelings. Okay, so moving on to our parallel survey, which, as I say, ran a little bit later from November onwards and entered into the sort of full lockdown period in January. We looked again at the commonly identified problems that cis heterosexual respondents from our mainstream survey reported. And foremost amongst their concerns identified as a big or fairly big problem by 61% of people was missing going to social events. that was followed by missing a holiday break. And I've put here in brackets where that was ranked on our LGBTQ survey. So that was third on our LGBTQ survey. Other problems were identified by cis heterosexual respondents. They accounted for about 50% of our respondents saying it was a big or fairly big problem. Obviously, we need to have a bit more of a look at the data, and if we're able to do parallel surveys again, we'll try and see what problems were identified in these other problem groups so that we can perhaps incorporate them on the next survey into a proper scaled up item. But it probably didn't fit so well with many cis heterosexual people's concerns. Then we get problems with sleeping, and at the fifth point, we get problems with mental health or well-being. So that was the first concern for LGBTQ people, but the fifth concern for cis heterosexual respondents. As I say, with LGBTQ people, just over half the respondents rated it as a big or fairly big problem, whereas it was rated as a fairly big or big problem by 46% of cis heterosexual people. So the actual percentage figures don't differ that much. It's just the rank order within the whole survey that differs. Then we have other issues like problems with health appointments or medication, problems with keeping myself fit, weight gain or weight loss, and that comes in at number 7, and that's 44% of people. So generally speaking, perhaps the second later cis heterosexual mainstream survey is picking up more people rating things at the big or fairly big problem level, and that's perhaps due to the level of lockdown and the level of pandemic concerns and anticipation of lockdown as well. Okay, so where does problems with increased alcohol use, smoking and substance use come? Well, it comes at number 13 in our cis heterosexual respondents list, but it's rated by 16% of respondents as a big or fairly big problem for them. So that actually is quite comparable to our rating amongst the LGBT survey of 14% of people saying it was a big or fairly big problem for them. Because we have such a huge data set, and it's more recent for us with our cis heterosexual respondents groups, this has only really been processed over the last 2 or 3 months. We haven't looked at all the open-ended answers that we've got, so the answers that people have typed in rather than circled on a rating scale. That's something that we will be looking forward to doing in the future. So we haven't got the same level of detail on the breakdown there as we have for our LGBTQ community as to what was said. Okay, but I just want to take a little break and focus in on this problems with increased alcohol, smoking use and substance use, and what respondents told us. We were able to do a couple of word clouds, and I'm sorry, it does look better in the full screen, but I've got a few extra bits that shouldn't be there. They're just where I've pasted my photograph over the top. So I'm sorry for that view. But what we have here is what people actually said in response, if they'd written anything in response to the problems with increased alcohol, smoking and substance use. And I've taken the data that was written, the words that were written, and simply used a word cloud program to show the two word clouds of all the words that were written. And this is the LGBTQ one, and this is the cis heterosexual group one. And as you can see, the two words in the masks look actually quite similar. They're in slightly different formats, so you can tell them apart, but it's very similar words that are coming up when people have written responses, which kind of, I suppose, gives us a bit more confidence in the fact that only around 15% of people said it was a really big problem and issue for them. We have not, as I said, looked any further at our cis heterosexual survey, but we did look at more specifically what the LGBTQ group have said. And so this is the things that people wrote as to why they'd circled 5 a very big problem for them, or 1 not a problem at all. And as I say, it was only a small number of people who actually wrote something underneath. And we're very grateful to people who wrote something underneath, but you couldn't write. There were so many open-ended questions that we wouldn't have expected anybody to have written something in response to all of them. So we had 9 people who actually gave us a detailed description for their circling a big problem. And of those 9 people who said that alcohol, smoking or substance use was a big problem, about half also mentioned mental health problems and difficulties. So just to give you one of the comments that was written, I feel I have been turning to alcohol to help with the boredom, depression and anxiety I have been experiencing. We also had somebody who said it was a big problem for them, but not because they were drinking heavily. What they said was, though I've quit drinking 11 weeks ago after seeing it's become a problem, what they said was, I would like to find an AA meeting to physically attend, but they're all online. So people who had problems and difficulties were finding difficulty finding support to sustain their sobriety. So what about those people at the other end who said it was not a problem? So of the 13 people who said ringed number 1 option, not a problem, most said they decreased their use since the pandemic began, and 5 people specifically mentioned it to the lockdown that had closed pub and club venues. So for some people the lockdown had helped, for other people it had made things more difficult. Okay, what about our pandemic positives? We had 17 positive gains that people could rate, and again these were generated from our earlier survey. The 10 most commonly identified positives for LGBTQ respondents, and just to pick out some highlights here, it was more availability of services online. Over half our people said that. So it is actually a big tribute, I think, to groups like Club Soda and Queers Without Beers, and all the other organizations that have really got out and really put out online resources, because that has really helped. Then we go to other things like not having to commute to work or college, time to start new activities, more online friendships. Number 7 is more time with my partner. Obviously, people had changed their working patterns, if they were lucky enough not to have been furloughed, or indeed been made redundant, then there was more time to spend with partner or partners. As I say, the increased accessibility and inclusion from services going online was the big positive, particularly for the LGBTQ community. And that shift to online had made a big difference in terms of accessibility and inclusion for some, because for actual physical services, there were often accessibility issues, or simply a long-term health condition could hold you back from going to those, or sometimes anxiety problems as well might be more of an issue in person than online. So somebody said, as someone with chronic fatigue, the increase in online services has been a boon. So that was a real positive. Okay. So looking again at our parallel survey with cis heterosexual respondents, and what were the 10 most commonly identified positives for them. Well, the first one, over half of people, 57%, ringed as a big or fairly big positive the fact that they didn't have to commute to work. And it's quite interesting that that's something that we don't hear a lot about, but just the stress of getting to work, to get to work on time, can be a real strain, and not having that, just going to a computer, or perhaps if you haven't got a job, there's still an advantage with not having the struggle to get out to work, even if you've got the financial disadvantages and other problems with it. And number 2, again over 50%, and number 3 at 50%, were more time with partners and more time with children. We then had more time at home generally, and number 5 at 44%, we had more services online. So that figured less in the cis heterosexual group than it did for the LGBT group, where the positive advantages for cis het people of spending more time with their partner or partners and more time with children didn't figure so highly amongst the LGBTQ group. Partners was up there, but not so highly rated as a positive. And children, I guess, because we don't know, but we will need to look into that, how many LGBTQ people in our survey had children. I think it was a smaller number, but again, we do need to check that out. So that item wouldn't have been so relevant to the LGBTQ group as a whole. So those are really our main results. And just to give you a little time for Q&A before we finish at 2. Our main conclusion really is actually at the moment is the huge variability both between the LGBTQ group and our cisgender heterosexual samples, but also the variability within those groups, and that is something that we will be looking to explore further. The next main point I want to identify is that some pandemic experiences were very similar across each of the LGBTQ group and the cis heterosexual group as well. So just to take the one example that we're particularly interested in today, ratings of alcohol and substance use as a problem were actually at very similar levels, about 15% in the entire sample, irrespective of gender identity and sexual identity, rated that as a big or a fairly big problem. And then we got some pandemic problems that were slightly different for each group. Over 50% of LGBTQ people were concerned about mental health problems. We had a similar proportion as we see in the cis heterosexual group, but it was only 5th on their list of concerns. In terms of the pandemic positives, sometimes there were similar gains and sometimes there were different gains. There was definitely the positive availability of online services for LGBTQ groups as a whole. And for the cis heterosexual group as a whole, it was increased time spent with partners and children that figured. So thank you very much for your attention and putting up with the technical problems that we've had. We do really appreciate your patience with that. And I hope the talk has been interesting. If you'd like to get in touch about our interview study, then please do. I'll put the slide up there, and I'm sure I could send Claire and Juicy details. We are at the moment, we've only got the funding to interview LGBTQ people, but again, we're always looking to get more funding and to expand the study further and to interview cis heterosexual people too. So thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was fantastic. You can bring down the slide deck if you like, and then we can see each other. That might be helpful when we have a discussion. So yeah, definitely if people want to get in touch, I think, obviously the breaking down the experience through the LGBT segment is, paramount to understanding and working towards, I guess, planning for the next issues in the next lockdown if we
yes yes, indeed, nobody knows.
There was just a few comments from people came in from Facebook, sort of this, which echoed that need around needing to see the GPs face to face rather than presumably virtual. So I thought that was interesting, that we've always got this, some people prefer in person clearly, and then others have benefited from that flexibility of online services that, and that was reflected in your study, wasn't it? And then the second comment was around, the fact that this user feels that everyone is drinking more, which from previous research that's been done, apparently around 25% of people are drinking more. But I guess your study is suggesting that they don't necessarily feel that that's a problem.
I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, we didn't take diary measures, and we didn't ask people for units. We just asked them whether they felt it was a problem for them during the pandemic. So it is a very different different type of measure, as you say. And also people are always very cagey about saying exactly what they're doing. So I'm not sure that we don't have sort of solid data on that. What we have is people identifying things as a difficulty for them, which is important because partly people identifying things as a difficulty shows where their attention is perhaps being drawn, where they might do something about it, or they might start feeling worse about themselves, and this kind of link to psychological well-being issues, I think, if you're tapping into people's feelings, is probably closer.
Yeah, I wonder how many would link perhaps increased alcohol consumption to issues of mental health, which was obviously very prominent in your survey for both groups, but particularly LGBT. And I guess there's that difference in the early study, that if for those on furlough perhaps, or working from home, there were less responsibilities to get in the way of that increased alcohol consumption. So whilst they may have been drinking more, it may have been less of a problem because there weren't those usual social responsibilities that people have. I just want to draw out a key theme that I thought came across was that of community, in both surveys, but it was very apparent, I think you touched upon it, that it was clear that the cis heterosexual people perhaps obtained their community through their nuclear family household bubble, whereas the LGBTQ community obviously heavily rely on that community external to their household living arrangements, perhaps. And so how much of an impact or difference do you think that created within the results?
I think that is something that's kind of behind those two different sets of patterns, and it perhaps goes into thinking that we need to support people in slightly different ways, and it's not a one size fits all. And social support is important for both groups, but what that actually looks like is slightly different for different people, depending partly on gender and sexual identity. So that sort of family and support networks are different, and that's one of the things that we want to kind of look at a bit more in our interview data, is how people are supported by the networks that they have, and to explore that more closely with our LGBTQ group, certainly initially, but we also, as I say, hope to extend again to further studies.
On that note of sort of analysis, final question from me, I guess, to just insert here, and it may be in the pipeline, but have you sort of broken down perhaps the LGBTQ data by age or life stage perhaps, and or gender, whether there are any differences across those segments?
We haven't yet, I'm afraid.
Okay.
That's something that we will certainly be doing, and yes, it's just such a big data set, and the whole sort of field of study just keeps changing, really, with the different demands of the pandemic and lockdown, that we're very, very slowly trying to kind of look into more detail as to try and relate variables together, particularly whether there are any substantial group differences within those two groups.
Yeah, it's a long-term play, I guess. You know, and await to hear more, I guess, either through publication or any further webinars that
yes,
you
we'll
do.
certainly keep you posted. Yes, thanks.
Please
Claire.
do. So you provided your email address. Is there any other way that people can keep sort of updated with the project, or, you know, your findings, that sort of thing?
We have two websites. I think I'm going to have to send you those, though I haven't got them to hand. I should have really thought of that, shouldn't I? And put the links in. But yes, I'll let you know with those
Great.
two.
And I'm sure, you know, a Google of your name and sort of the profile, you know, on Beck and so on, it will.
Oh yes, it all picks up. Yes.
Yeah, so people can find you there. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to, you know, show us sort of a different angle on well-being, drinking, lockdown, all very current and topical issues. So thank you very much.
Oh, good. I really appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Great. We look to maybe have you back once you've had more findings. So
yes, certainly. Please do. Yes. Okay.
Great. Thanks. And people can watch again on YouTube and Facebook. So we'll keep you updated with that. So
wonderful.
Thank you very much. We'll just hold on and then turn the recording off.